Cuando los enfrentamos nosotros y nosotras, estómagos hambrientos, los imperialistas buscan sus armas. Cuando los imperialistas nos enfrentan, nosotros y nosotras, estómagos hambrientos, unimos nuestros brazos y marchamos hacia adelante.
Humanity is threatened by invisible virus that spreads rapidly, but we have long been challenged by other viruses such as unemployment, hunger, racism, patriarchy, inequality and war.
Estes vírus se manifestam de maneiras diferentes em diferentes partes do mundo e atacam profundamente a vida dos trabalhadores e das trabalhadoras, e dos camponeses e das camponesas, e de todos aqueles que sofrem os impactos da desigualdade social. Entretanto, uma minoria de pessoas lucram muito com essa devastação.
El sistema capitalista no tiene respuestas para esta crisis. Sus políticas son huecas. En lugar de buscar una manera de alimentarnos y albergarnos, los capitalistas construyen vastas maquinarias de destrucción, fuerzas policiales y militares que sofocan la vida de la clase trabajadora en las naciones ricas y del campesinado y la clase trabajadora en las naciones más pobres.
عندما تحاول دولة فقيرة أن تقف منتصبة وتسعى إلى ممارسة سيادتها، فإنها تجد في مواجهتها ترسانة كاملة من القوة تستخدم ضدها، سواء كانت مالية أو دبلوماسية أو عسكرية. إنهم يهيمنون علينا بالسلاح وبالأفكار أيضاً، من خلال محاولة إقناعنا بأن وجهات نظرهم هي وجهات النظر الصحيحة.
Os administradores do sistema capitalista se apressaram a desfundar suas armas e apontar a adversários distantes, a conduzir seus tanques hacia nossas terras e a ocupar nossos lugares, a destroçar a natureza e a destruir nosso mundo. Para eles, é mais fácil provocar guerras que cenar o estômago de los seres humanos com comida.
They would rather inflame people with racism and jigonism than to manage the fact that a broken system has come to rely more and more on the unacknowledged care labor of women, more and more on the harsh working conditions imposed on miners and factory workers.
The planet is on fire. The viruses are on the march. Hunger stalks the land. And yet, even in this mess, we, the vast majority of the people on this planet, have not given up on the possibility of a future.
We hope for something better than this. A world beyond profit and privilege. A world beyond capitalism and imperialism. A world singing the song of humanity. Our hearts are bigger than their guns. Our love and our struggle will overcome their greed and indifference.
Nuestros movimientos están plantando muchas semillas. Necesitamos regarlas, cuidarlas, asegurarnos de que florezcan.
Construiremos un futuro que atesore la vida antes que las ganancias. Un futuro de hermandad entre los pueblos en lugar de guerras racistas. Un futuro en el que las jerarquías sociales sean abolidas y disfrutemos de la dignidad mutua. Solo cuando está lo suficientemente oscuro se podrán ver las estrellas. Hoy está lo suficientemente oscuro. El imperialismo caerá.
Imperialism will fall.
El imperialismo caerá.
El imperialismo caerá.
Imperialism will fall.
Imperialismo cairá.
Imperialism will fall.
Imperialism will fall.
Imperialism will fall.
El imperialismo caerá.
All right, comrades. Imperialism will fall. Imperialism must fall for the sake of humanity. I want to welcome everybody that's on this call today. We are hosting this out of the People's Forum. We are a cultural and educational space in New York City, but we are closed because of the pandemic, and we're shifting a lot of our educational and cultural programming online, which has given us the opportunity to reach so many more people and also bring in educators from all across the US and internationally. And so we want to thank folks that are on this call. We're here because we know that to be a revolutionary today is to be an educator armed with revolutionary theory and practice. And we must understand the theories around imperialism, capitalism, and arm the youth to be the leaders of today and of the future. So I want to thank the educators that are part of this panel, comrades Yexenia, Manu, and Karla. I'm going to pass it on to you. Thank you so much for hosting this webinar.
Thank you, David. Peace and welcome, everyone. Happy International Anti-Imperialism Week. I don't know if that's a thing, but it should be. My name is Yexenia Venegas, and I'll be the moderator for today's discussion on teaching youth about anti-imperialism. So we're here to share ideas, stories, methods of teaching anti-imperialism. I am an educator in Detroit Public Schools for the past 4 years. I have been doing political organizing for about a decade now. I've been part of a lot of groups, but more recently and more relevant is the General Baker Institute and MICOR, which is the Michigan Caucus of Rank and File Educators with the union. And I'm very, very excited for today's discussion. We have very knowledgeable panelists, and I'm going to ask each panelist to briefly introduce themselves, who they are, what they do, who their teaching audience is. And then Manu will give us a brief, just presentation or brief talk about what imperialism is, and then we'll begin our questions and discussions. So I'm going to ask the panelists to introduce themselves. So Karla, if you could introduce yourself, and then Manu, you can introduce yourself and go into what is imperialism.
Thanks so much, Yexenia. So my name is Karla Reyes, and I teach in the New York City public schools. I teach in Manhattan now. This is my 10th year teaching. So it's been quite some time. I teach special education focused on math. So that's mostly what it's been the last few years. And what else? Oh, in terms of my organizing, I organized with the Party for Socialism and Liberation almost for 8 years. So around the same time as teaching. And that wasn't a coincidence for sure. And also with the Justice Center en el Barrio, which is located in East Harlem. And I'm also one of the managing editors of a socialist feminist publication called Breaking the Chains, which has been an exciting project for the last few years. Yeah, and I think, yeah, thanks.
Hi, everyone. I'm really glad and honored to be with you and have a chance to participate in the Anti-Imperialism Week with people standing up around the world. My name is Manu. I teach at a college. I'm also in New York. I teach college here. And yeah, most of my teaching has been at the college level. So I'm really excited to be in conversation with educators working in community and in high school, middle school, elementary. I spent a lot of time around elementary school kids. And thinking about how to teach imperialism to 7- and 8-year-olds. I wrote a book called Empire's Tracks, Indigenous Nations, Chinese Workers, and the Transcontinental Railroad, in which I studied imperialism. That's the main theme of the book. And in addition to teaching on campuses, I've also been fortunate to teach at the People's Forum, which has taught me a lot about pedagogy. So maybe I'll just jump into the idea of imperialism quickly and just pedagogical questions that arise from me. So just this morning, I was doing some research and looking at a testimony that a representative from Florida was giving in Congress in the early 1960s, where he was urging US military action against Cuba in his words, to say to prevent communist imperialism from spreading to the Western Hemisphere. Those were his words. So it's really important for us to define what imperialism is and have a shared definition, because the term is used in many ways to really obfuscate and confuse people. And so, you know, I think a lot of clarity about imperialism is essential for understanding and talking about it. And I just broke down a few definitions about imperialism. One comes from Lenin, who many of us, you know, have learned from. And Lenin insists that imperialism is the highest stage of capitalism. It arises through the historical development of capitalism. And, you know, in the text, Lenin, he writes about the suspension of competition and the development of financial cartels that compete for territory. And Lenin was coming up with this thesis to explain why the First World War happened, a war which was unimaginable in Europe, and a war in which the Second International, the standard bearers of socialism up until that point, you know, in which they capitulated to their respective capitalist classes. So this is Lenin, the highest stage of capitalism. This is imperialism. There's an Indian historian, Amiya Kumar Bakshi, who's a reader of Lenin and writing in this tradition, who has a definition I also find really useful. He describes imperialism as the persistent tendency of mature capitalist states to foment violent crisis. So it's the tendency of capitalist states, once they achieve you know, position of maturity, to create conditions of war and crisis in order for the survival of those capitalist states. So that's a way to think about imperialism. Vijay Prashad recently talked about imperialism in a way that I found very clear and very helpful. He was describing imperialism as a continuation of the methods through which the capitalist class historically rose through power, which was through the era of colonialism. So imperialism, you know, it continues those methods and those relationships in order to sustain, in order to maintain the power of the capitalist class. And in my own research, I've looked at the ways that imperialism, in many ways, when we look at it, we can see war and finance capital kind of conjoining together. Where we see imperialism, we see both of these at play. War is informed by finance capital, and finance capital is informing war and a drive to war. So I wanted to bring those definitions up because imperialism isn't a particular policy. I think that's often a misunderstanding, that imperialism is a policy that we can oppose for a better policy, that we can reform, you know, for a better foreign policy, let's say. But imperialism isn't a policy, it's the nature of capitalism. It's the nature of class rule. So a corollary of that would be that working class politics and anti-imperialism are one and the same. They can't be separated. So anti-imperialism is not a luxury for working class politics. And anti-imperialists are not fully anti-imperialist, thoroughly anti-imperialist, unless their primary goal is to unify and mobilize the working class. So it's not a bad policy. It's the nature of capitalism today. Lenin, in Imperialism, he was writing about what at that time was called an anti-imperialist movement in the United States. That really was a large movement that included such, you know, dignitaries and luminaries as Mark Twain, famous people, a lot of people involved in this, who were criticizing the US colonial moves in Puerto Rico, in Cuba, and in the Philippines after the war in 1898. And Lenin describes that movement as a pious wish. It's a phrase that I think, to me, carries a lot of meaning. It's a pious wish, he says, because they failed to, that movement failed to address the roots of class power. They failed to address the corporations that sought to profit from the colonization of the Philippines, of Cuba, and Puerto Rico. And in failing to address the underlying class relations, he says, it's a pious wish. So even if the people had their hearts in the right place, they would be bound to fail because they weren't actually addressing the root of the problem. So lastly, I thought it might be useful to maybe talk about a couple of examples of imperialism today and how we might think of it and for the college level. So I'm very interested in learning from to teach at other levels. But there's two examples that come to mind. One is Venezuela and one is China. And so, the Carter Center has a series of reports. The Carter Center, it does, founded by Jimmy Carter, it does election monitoring in elections around the world. And it has a series of reports where they went down and monitored elections in Venezuela since the Bolivarian Revolution began. And I think in the most recent, you can find all these on their website. They're all publicly available. In the most recent report they made, I forget which year it was, which election, they said that, they wrote that as the Carter Center, based in Georgia, they actually wished that elections in the United States would have the same kind of security that that the elections they observed in Venezuela had. And so when, in the case of Venezuela, when we hear a drive towards aggression towards Venezuela on the idea that their democracy is a failed democracy or it's non-existent, for the working classes in the United States, it raises the question of, what is the status of democracy here in this country? And what could be learned, what could be gained, what lessons could be learned from the Venezuelan experience to have more secure elections where not only the actual process of the vote and tallying the vote, but also the choices that are available for people to vote on, and the participation of working class people, of oppressed and dispossessed communities in the electoral process. And in the case of China, of course, we have been reading for the past year and a half, 2 years, an escalation of US attacks on Chinese companies like Huawei, TikTok, and WeChat. This is happening, it's developing every day. And what we're told in the United States is that these companies present a threat to national security. They present a threat to the security of our privacy and our information. So again, there's a question to raise after the revelations that Edward Snowden made. We know that all of the ways that we communicate electronically are under surveillance by the so-called Five Eyes, which is led by the United States. So there's a question to pose: who's the greater threat to working class people in the United States, to the working class movement in the United States, and to, let's say, the privacy and security of individual working class people? Is it these Chinese companies, or is it the Five Eyes? Is it the signals intelligence run by the United States? And there's a text that could be useful to teach for that, which is also easily available, which was a speech given by Mike Pompeo, the Secretary of State, at the Nixon Library just about a month ago, maybe a month and a half ago, where he talks about his assessment of the threat of the Chinese government. And he says, the goal of the United States is to remove the Chinese Communist Party from power. That's the goal. And so again, the question to the working class movement in the United States, or to working class people, what is the threat to the movement and to the well-being of working class people, oppressed people, dispossessed communities? Is it Mike Pompeo, or is it Huawei? So that's a little bit I had to, hopefully that's useful to give us some common language to start off with our discussion.
Thank you, Manu, for that information and the knowledge, to have a shared understanding about imperialism, which is clearly it's a vast system of oppression rooted in historical, in the development of capitalism. So I would love to start a discussion. I have some questions prepared here. I also know, Karla, I would love maybe if you can start us off. You wanted to talk a little bit about your classroom, what you do with math, and how you kind of dive into this. And I'm going to ask the question, so maybe you can fold your that discussion into the question. Yeah. So, to start off, what are some tips on where to start teaching anti-imperialism to youth? Where do you start, or when do you start talking about imperialism? And are there any methods, any stories or strategies that you use to talk to imperialism to your learners, to your students, to your folks? So I'm Karla, you can start, then Manu, and I'll put in my 2 cents, as we go along.
Okay. Thanks again for having me. I think this is really exciting, and we often, in the endless professional development that teachers have to do, don't get the time to really think about this and really think about, how are we teaching young people? What are we teaching them? And I think over the years, one of the major things that I've learned, and also being mentored by coworkers through over the years from different backgrounds, is that, as we know as organizers, we don't live single issue lives. So to teach in a way that only focuses on a particular content or a particular angle just doesn't make sense. And also, like, neurologically, like, your brain doesn't work like that. You don't isolate different content. So I teach math now, but I'm a certified special ed teacher. So I've had to teach everything. I taught middle school for 6 years. And I had to teach, like, world history, which is, huge, and depending on who's teaching it, could be teaching horribly, or young people, right? And also, like, I teach in New York City. It's the most segregated public school system in the country. So if you teach in a public school, you're most likely not teaching anyone affluent, but you're mostly teaching children of immigrants themselves, or descendants of people who have been enslaved. Like, you're teaching people who are carrying tons of generational trauma, and living it throughout their lives. So I think one thing that's been key for me has been to make those interdisciplinary connections. So for example, with my coworker, we were planning a class on reparations. So that means, one, you're bringing in economics. Two, you can bring in math easily because you can map out neighborhoods, look at generational wealth, like, how much people are people owed things, like, if people had a farm with like 24 people, how much wealth did they accumulate, and how much wealth is stolen? You could talk about looting, and that's the imperialism piece, right? You could talk about, like, all these different, all the colonizers, how much money did they take from these different countries that now we call the developing world? And so topics like that, I think, if you really have to map it out, and it's not short, it's a really long process. And so I think that's something else I've learned, a collaborative nature to create this type of content. So that's one piece, interdisciplinary piece. And I also wanted to bring up relationships. I think this is like the soft skill of teaching. They call it soft, but it's really like a cornerstone, in my opinion. Like, nobody learns unless they feel safe. And again, that's like something innate in our nature. You don't open up, you don't open your mind to new ideas until you know that you're safe and heard in the space around you. So I think that's another really important piece, is, not that like a top-down approach. And I don't want to say, like, I don't believe in hierarchies. That's like a whole separate question. But like, I think that understanding that, students aren't vessels. And I think, being open to a relationship that goes back and forth. I always hear this phrase, like, we must center the youth. Well, I've been doing this for a long time, and I've accumulated a lot of experience. Like, I also have a lot to, like, teach. So when people say center the youth, that doesn't make too much sense to me. I think we should center the struggle, and we should struggle together and understand that we're struggling together. And I think that's a really important piece of this, showing that, like, we're people who are struggling and like struggling for the same things that they're struggling for, right? Like housing, education, health, and like, I think making our relationships more equal so that we can learn from each other is really important. I could go on for a really long time. So I'm going to pause just to let other folks respond.
Manu, would you like to respond to the question?
Sure, I'd like to hear Karla talk more. It's really interesting to just think about math reparations in this way. I mean, that's great. I can really relate to the emphasis on relationships that you said. And for the teaching, which for me, it's once students have finished high school, and especially the college classes, it's a strange thing to teach imperialism on a college campus, because college campuses, like nonprofits, are essentially about taking people away from class struggle, no matter where they originate from. And so it's hard to actually speak with clarity even if you're reading Lenin, reading the same text that we could be reading off of a campus. So it's actually been extremely eye-opening for me to teach the material at the People's Forum or in spaces off campus, where the material comes alive so much more, because it's not about reproducing class power. It becomes about something else. And I think this, for me, this question of relationships is so key. The relationships of the people in the room, and then to think, right now, this morning, in a day-to-day kind of way, to begin to map out the relationships that connect us to other people in other parts of the world, and other struggles happening elsewhere in the world. One way, the commodity fetish that Marx writes about in volume 1 of Capital is such an abstract idea, but it's so concrete too, that every object that we use every day actually puts us directly into relationship with hundreds, if not thousands of people whose faces we'll never see. But our ability to live, our everyday life is predicated on that. And these kinds of things where we can pick up an object and think, where did this object come? How did it get in my hands? And who has touched it? And what are the histories of struggle, of life, that are embedded in this object as it's come into my hands, into my life or into our lives. I think the emphasis on relationships and the emphasis on materiality, on what's concrete. Again, in college and nonprofits, all these places, everything is really wrought through with idealism. And it's that thing that Lenin was talking about, it's the pious wish. So even people's hearts, they see what's happening. Maybe they see what's happening, that what Mike Pompeo is talking about with China, and something feels wrong. How to make that concrete, I think, is an important pedagogical question, rather than just keeping it at the level of, this is immoral, this is unethical. So.
Thank you for both your answers. I'm going to put in my 2 cents and loop in the other question as well. I really appreciate the emphasis on relationships and the emphasis of the interdisciplinary aspect of learning. I agree, we don't learn in single content areas. That's not possible. I'm an art teacher currently, so I'm really able to pull anything I want into whatever I'm doing. And this idea of the materiality of things, I think, is super important, because when you do ask kids, like, where do you think this thing comes from? How is it made? Where are the materials sourced? How are they sourced? Who's getting those materials? Who's putting the materials together? When you start to do those investigations, you begin to see all those little chains that go around the globe, right? That connect the supply chain to the US. So I think that's super important. And also, as a teacher who teaches kindergarten all the way to 8th grade, I have a little anecdote to share about how I was trying to begin this process of teaching about imperialism, trying to use Columbus, because every kid is taught about Columbus, right? And sailing the ocean blue and whatever, that little rhyme. And I was teaching my 3rd graders, and I had this whole lesson predicated upon the fact that they knew who Columbus was and what he did, and predicated upon that, he was being celebrated. So I was super excited. It was Indigenous Peoples Day. I got my lesson together. I had an awesome presentation. I had an art project to go along with it. And I get there, and so I start to ask them, who was Christopher Columbus and what did he do? And they had never heard of him yet. And so my whole lesson, which was built up on the contrast, I all of a sudden realized I wasn't prepared to tell the story from scratch. And I got so nervous that I kind of decided to wait and redo it. So the fact that students, even though being taught about Christopher Columbus in the way that the US does it is completely upside down and completely untrue, because I didn't have that set up, I wasn't able to teach the true story, because I was like, now that's a lot of responsibility resting on my shoulders to get it right. So I say that to say that even when students don't know that information, it makes teaching about imperialism still challenging. And even that information, the students not having that information, is really unacceptable, because they're in 3rd grade, which is about 9 years old, and you're able to understand some important topics and concepts, and that are really tied to the history of this country. So that, and I wanted to share that anecdote because I thought it was kind of funny. So leading to this other question, and I'm gonna start with you, Manu, for this question. What are some building blocks that we can teach younger students in elementary, middle school, so that when they get to high school and then college, they can understand the concepts of imperialism better? So, as a college professor, I assume when students get to you, they have a certain level of knowledge that they've acquired through all this schooling. So what are some things that you wish students had been instilled beforehand, before getting to your classroom, so that they could take that understanding of imperialism a little bit deeper? Because it is a big, complex topic. And so it's not, you can explain it away in a day, it takes time. So what do you wish your students had when they got to you?
I really appreciate that question. It's something that my students talk about a lot when we learn. I think there's two things. They're interrelated. One is the Civil War period. I teach a lot about the Civil War, even when I'm teaching about contemporary life. But the US Civil War and Reconstruction, and the assaults on Reconstruction. And when students learn this, it's pretty widespread. No matter where they've gone to school, where they grew up, they say that they had no idea about the true history of the Civil War, what was happening, what were the stakes, what happened during Reconstruction, and what this society has lost in the aftermath of that. And I think the Civil War is related to imperialism because, well, situated as we are in the heart of imperialism, it's the question that the Second International was facing, that Lenin was facing. What's the task of the working class when imperialist war breaks out? Those parties of the Second International, those major socialist parties, they aligned with their countries. But Lenin and others in his wing of the movement said, no, the task is to fight a civil war against the capitalist classes within the country when they started imperialist war. And so I think the Civil War actually has a lot to teach us about imperialism, and here in the United States, it has a lot to teach us about our role. What's demanded of us to fulfill what's necessary for anti-imperialism. Yeah, I think that's the main thing. There's probably some other things, but I'll stop there.
Got it. Civil War, teaching the Civil War correctly, I think would be a great start. Karla, do you have something to add?
Yeah, when I taught middle school, I taught sixth grade self-contained for a bit. And self-contained are the students who are in a public school setting, but they can't necessarily be in the inclusive setting with students who don't have diagnosed disabilities. So they are separated into a smaller classroom. And so a lot of these students don't know basics. They might be 11 or 12 and are honestly illiterate, right? Like they really cannot read and write, and number sense and mathematical reasoning is really not there. And so one thing that I did, which I think is probably one of the best things I've done in my teaching career, is really focus on storytelling. And teaching them that storytelling is a really great way to learn. And it's also based in our cultures, right? Like you always remember something that like an elder taught you, or a story that someone you heard at church or whatever it is. And I think in that way, you can kind of bring in different historical figures. I was listening to Sonia Vaz Borges, who I know has been at the People's Forum. And, she was talking about how, in Guinea-Bissau, I believe, they didn't have the content. They had to use Portuguese textbooks to teach the students because they didn't have other content, but then they had to create their content. And I think we're really lucky that we don't have to create content. We have a lot of content. So I was able to use in this like storytelling and memoir writing, I was able to use Malcolm X's autobiography when he learns how to read in prison. And I was able to use, there's a story that Sonia Manzano wrote, and she's from Sesame Street, but she's really great. The Evolution of Evelyn Serrano. And it's about a 13-year-old girl in East Harlem who meets the Young Lords. And she has she's 13, which is around the same age. And you're able to easily bring in the 13-point program of the Young Lords. It's about an anti-colonial struggle, an anti-imperialist struggle, based in international solidarity and based in solidarity with the Black Panthers and with the Black nation. Like, that's really powerful. And so they were able to create these stories and like learn this historical context. And I just think there's a lot of power in the content that we choose too. We're not starting from scratch like they have in other places. We are standing on the shoulders of giants in a way. And I think that's something we should remember when teaching.
Thank you. I want to piggyback off the storytelling part, and also a little bit of what Manu was saying about the civil rights. I use this book called When You Have a Bully for President. I think that's the title. It's those words, When You Have a Bully for President, by Maya Gonzalez. And it's a really great book for kindergarten, I would say up to high school, really, because it breaks down the ideas of colonization and oppression as bullying, basically. And bullying is a form of domination over another thing. So it really was able to give me the vocabulary to be able to begin to breach these topics of, well, what is racism, Ms. Venegas? Or, well, I don't understand, and I was able to say, well, it's kind of like a type of bullying. And then I'd be able to use that as a frame of reference. And that was really helpful. So I suggest that book for a lot of folks. It touches upon, colonization and slavery. It touches upon the annexation of Mexico into the US. It doesn't go into depth, but it gives it a reference for kids to be able to understand using particular language that they're already familiar with. So that's really, really important. And I always think about this question about how do we build upon the knowledge of our students, and how do we make sure that we're not just using the banking system where you're just like trying to fill up a receptacle with your information, because that's definitely not how students learn. And we actually know very little still about how human minds learn. So that's also something to take into consideration. But I break it down for different grade bands. So like K2, then third grade to fifth grade, then we have middle school 6 to 8, then we have high school. Each of those, I imagine, need to have particular understanding of moments in history. And I think that's one way that I began to try and figure out how would I create a curriculum that would incorporate, what imperialism is. So whether we teach Civil War in middle school and get really in depth and focus on that time period and everything around the world happening in the time period. And then in the lower grades, the Christopher Columbus story, but we would tell it in the real way. We would tell what actually happened. Like, he never even came to America, like to start off there, for example, right? And then being able to break off into more complex things in high school with that foundation already, so that when they get to the university level, then they'd be able to really dig into the here and now and build analysis from the current moment, and not have to undo all that learning, then redo the new stuff, and now begin to be able to analyze the world with this new lens. That was a lot, but just some thoughts there. So I'm gonna move on to the next question. So as educators, right, how do we better connect our fronts of struggle to the broader anti-imperialist struggle, whether it's anti-racism, work, and immigration? How do we begin to connect that all together as educators in the systems that we're in? I'm gonna pick somebody to go first, or if anybody feels inclined to go first, because I could do the teacher thing, I'll just cold call. Okay, I'm gonna pick Manu just because Karla just finished speaking before me.
All right. I actually want to piggyback off of what you just said about storytelling.
Go ahead.
And I'll answer your question, but I'm a parent, so I spend a lot of time around kids who are my son's age and his friends, and this generation is really interested in superheroes, and there's superheroes right now. There's of course Black Panther and Miles Morales and Ms. Marvel and all these characters. And these superheroes themselves open up, I think, conversations about imperialism. Of course, what's the CIA doing in Wakanda? Or why is Miles Morales' dad named Jefferson Davis? Do you know who Jefferson Davis is? And why would a Black man be named Jefferson Davis? So it can be an opening to think about not just, the stories and the propaganda efforts and the propaganda effects. I've seen my son, get very fascinated with outer space programs. And it's very interesting. He kind of himself sees and has noticed the difference between the historic Soviet space program and the US space program. One which we can connect to imperialism, and the other much more about a much more humanist approach to science. But so how is imperialism connect? How does imperialism connect to the different fronts of struggle? I think one lesson for me, imperialism is it's a name for the totality. It's another name for capitalism. So the fronts of struggle are all connected through imperialism. And I think one of the big challenges as a teacher in college is to get people to think about the work intellectually or the work practically that needs to happen to unify the working class. Because no matter where they come from, no matter what consciousness they bring, everything about college is about drumming that consciousness out and that kind of commitment out. But anti-imperialism, I think, is one of these vehicles to unify the working class, whether we're talking about anti-immigration, immigrant justice, against police violence, police brutality, anti-racism, elements of the queer and trans struggle. All of these are connected in ways, to anti-imperialism. There's new scholarship now coming out about AIDS activism in the 1980s. And these early generations of AIDS activists here in New York, they were anti-imperialists, and they saw it directly connected. Their struggle for medicine, for a state that wouldn't be surveilling and attacking them, they saw as integrally connected to the struggle to prevent the US government from its adventurous and violent, its violent adventures in Central America and the Middle East. So, we can look historically and see the connections that people made. And I think anti-imperialism is precisely that point of connection, because imperialism, again, it names the totality, it names everything. It's a way of naming, the structure itself.
Thank you, Manu. That made me think of some other questions I have here that Karla, I'm really interested. As a public school teacher and a public school teacher, we are technically, right, not supposed to teach about anything political per se, or that's what I've read in my contract. So I'm wondering what kinds of challenges you faced in school when you're trying to teach about imperialism and any of these topics that often we're told that we're not supposed to teach because it's too political. So I'm wondering what challenges you face. And likewise, Manu, I'm gonna shoot that to you as a college professor. What challenges have you faced trying to teach imperialism within an institution? Go ahead, Karla.
Yeah, that's definitely the unspoken thing that we have not touched upon, right? While I love being a unionized worker with a contract, it says we can't be political. However, I do think that, and it's been my experience having worked at a couple of schools, it also depends on what school you're at and the liberty that you'll have there. And then also when I talked about that story, the memoir unit I had done with the different pieces, the essence was teaching my students how to read and find a central idea and write about one, the main idea. Because they didn't know how to do that. So that was how I kind of spun it, right? Where it's oh, hi, I have my lesson plan. What do I need to do to make sure I don't get fired? Well, I need to have this, I need to have this, I need to have this. And then you can argue less about my content, what I'm using, if I have all these other pieces, if I make sure I'm not late, right? So I think there's ways to finesse and get around that for sure. I did want to bring up a piece about uniting the struggles from the outside with students and the anti-imperialist struggle. I did last year a unit with my high schoolers about the MTA budget, right? The train budget in New York. Everyone knows about the trains. Everyone hates the trains. They're always making you late. And the prices keep on going up over the years. And I think it's very relatable to everyone. And then also seeing how the fares are going up and there's more police in the stations. And then especially high schoolers, often may not have the money. So end up jumping the turnstiles a lot and getting arrested or getting hit with fines. And the fines were used to justify this budget. And so I was able to connect all of that to math. And so I remember having my principal come in the very first day when I was showing them videos of, police beating young people, for jumping the turnstiles. And they were all like yelling and screaming at the guy on TV and, you know, cursing the police. And I'm not stopping them from cursing. And I'm also not stopping them from reacting. And she walks in and she's just like, oh, I thought something bad was happening, when she realized it was like the video and like she knew what the content was going to be. She kind of like walked out like, all right, I'm just going to like let it happen. You know, it makes you think about militarism, right? Like how money could be used and is used. And unfortunately, I think in retrospect, I would try to incorporate more of that in the unit. But I think that's another way, right? Budgets are like a huge way. Talk about like, what do people need? How is money being spent? Why isn't it being spent on people needs instead it's being used to like fund wars abroad? And I think that's like a very basic and logical connection to make for young people. That's already part of their lived experience.
Thank you, Karla. I also want to mention, please, folks who are watching, thank you so much for being with us. If you have questions, please ask them through the Q&A option. We'll be happy to respond to some, maybe all, depending how many we have. So just look out for that. This is a great conversation so far, and I'm really thankful for everything that's been said so far. I would like to know, what are the kinds of questions that young people ask when it comes to imperialism? What are the kinds of answers that the ruling class, educational institutions, mainstream media give to young people? What do you think feel needs to be learned or unlearned? So anybody can jump in on this, or I will just cold call again.
Well, I can jump in. It's
ahead.
something I face a lot, and I would say it's not only young people. It's reproduced by many academics, many of my colleagues. I think consciously and not, and that's you know, with an unclear definition of imperialism, people, it's like they're blasting in all directions. They're talking about like that congressperson from Florida who I talked about in the early '60s. You know, today they'll talk about Chinese imperialism, you know, with great passion, how we need to stop Chinese imperialism. And or they'll talk about, you know, anti-imperialism as authoritarian, anti-imperialism as aligning with authoritarian governments, anti-imperialism as guilty of human rights abuses. So these are some of the kind of ways that I think people, the kind of traps that people fall into. And to me, they all, the root of all of these traps is an unclear definition of what imperialism is. And that goes back, you know, in the US, that goes back at least to the early 1980s. Very, very well-known and successful academics and intellectuals in the United States, some of whom even called themselves Marxists, who contributed to this, have been contributing for decades to this confusion about the nature of imperialism.
Karla, would you like to add on?
Yeah, I think, you know, something that Manu said really made me think about like the coronavirus pandemic, right? And I think that this is my math brain going on, but like the numbers, right? And like the government responses from like the United States versus China versus Cuba, you know, I think, and Vietnam, like probably being like a shining example. I think that that's like a really great way. You know, if you look at graphs and like actually look at the numbers and look at what the government response was, you can really combat this idea that America is exceptional and like can do no wrong, and that these other places are, you know, bad, you know, authoritarian, you know, just, you know, really competing and like bringing down what makes America great. Like you're really able to combat those narratives just with like using science and numbers. And I think that's also a really important thing that we can do to have young people kind of finding answers on their own.
Thank you. That answered one of the questions here. How can I help spread anti-imperialism in a way that people won't say it's biased, by Usman? So that's perfect, right? We have numbers and data that clearly show what our economy is doing and our military is doing to the rest of the world. So I think that's a really important place to start, especially for older students who are ready for that kind of information. So I think that's important. There's another question here. how do you broach the topic of anti-racism pedagogy in class and help students unlearn their internalized racism and notice systemic racism? Ooh, I mean, all of these are difficult. They're all difficult to teach and unlearn. But anybody have anecdotes or something they'd like to share? I have my own, but I'd like to see if Manu or Karla.
Yeah, I think that in all of these, like immediately what I'm thinking of, like in the same graphs, like not only looking at like the difference in like countries and how they responded to the virus, but like prisons, who gets murdered, which rape kits get checked, if any, right? When we're talking about sexual assault, like there's so many different ways. And I think also in undoing internalized racism, you know, a lot of schools, and I don't think it's done evenly, but I think it is a good start, is restorative justice practices. You know, one of my coworkers is amazing at that. I've never seen somebody finesse like relationships in that way, teaching conflict resolution, training young people on like how to repair relationships instead of viewing people as disposable. Like those little things I think do make a huge difference. And it's not like, you know, from one day to the next, but I think it's collective accountability, which is different, right? It's different from a capitalist model where like, you know, you're punished, you're disposed of, you're kind of like cast to the shadows, especially if you're Black or brown. And I think viewing people as people who can change, but everyone can transform, because that's what we ultimately want to do. If you want to create a revolution, you have to believe people can change. And I think that restorative justice is a small step in that direction.
I 100% agree. I just want to piggyback a little bit off that, because I feel like that relationship piece, especially because I always think in the younger grades, because that's where a lot of my years have been spent, is teaching K2 students. And, you know, it's hard to figure out, do I want to show them videos of people getting killed or shot or what have you to these very young kids? So how can I reframe this in a way that I'm not going to just traumatize them? Because that's something that does happen. And it's a question I haven't been able to answer yet. Because as I grow as a teacher, every single student that you get is different. Every classroom is different. So you're always readjusting a little bit to what is in front of you. But when it comes to the racism part, you know, there are lots of resources out there, like different books, but there's a resource, I'm trying to think of the name right now, Teaching Tolerance. It's not super leftist, but it does have some good lessons that you can base off of, start using to teach kids about history and build up their self-worth. Because when I teach mostly African-American students and Black and brown poor students, so what I've found for that internalized racism is like we have to be building up our kids' confidence and understanding of themselves in relation to other people and how we're literally all connected. So in my classroom, what I try to get students to understand, especially because I'm in an art classroom, I try and do it through the use of our supplies. We don't get a lot of supplies, so I have to really budget for 600 students. And it's hard. So I try to involve my students in that process so they begin to understand how resources are important and how you can actually allocate them in a fair manner, no matter the skill set, or no matter if you're a real artist or just in class because you're trying to get an A. Like everyone's deserving of these basic supplies, and kind of using as an analogy for our basic needs. I'm still working on that process, so don't ask me how it's going just yet, because I just began developing that kind of idea for my classroom. Manu, did you want to add on?
Sure. I'm really just learning so much from what both of you are sharing from your experiences. It's really great to hear. I think one of the ways that I see racism or teaching anti-racism, one of the real challenges is that students are, it's almost like every reinforcement institutionally and socially is to understand anti-racism through the lens of idealism, through an idealist politics. And so ultimately the platform for anti-racism becomes about, you know, becomes about cultural recognition, or psychology, transforming the way people think, and it moves away from material questions. It moves away from class and the materiality of race. And I think it's connected to what Karla was saying. There's such a deep kind of profound assumption that I see in my students that people can't change. And so what we need to do is figure out how to navigate where we're all situated, where we start, to start the story. And so that leads to, the pressures really are to, politics of autonomy and separation and anarchism. And that's really, I find for me in teaching anti-racism, even the history of anti-racism in this country and its connection to anti-imperialism, it's a lot of this is really trying to get hit against these, it's almost like an anarchist common sense that develops among my students. And it happens cohort after cohort, year after year. I'm sadly seeing it, but really great, smart students who I'm working with now. And so that's one of the biggest challenges that I find myself facing.
Can I add something super brief?
Go for it.
Okay. Yeah, just something that Manu was just talking about. It makes me think about also looking at the active struggle. Like the last 6 months, well, not 6 months, how many months? 4 months? Just like the uprising against racism and like people actually taking action to change the course of history and being like the change makers. And I think that speaks to that point about like change and, and not just being individual, but collective, and people often getting erased in history. And like right now, what do we see? Like the media says one thing, but you probably went out with your parents to these protests. You probably went out yourself in the middle of the night. You saw what happened. And like, how do we document that and make that part of like our collective memory together?
Thank you for that piece, Karla. So we're getting to the end of our time. I have one final question to end with, so we can maybe fold our conclusions into this. I wanted to end on a little more of a happy note. Like, what do you imagine liberated education for people look like, for young people and also just for people? What does that look like to you? And I, again, whoever feels inclined to answer, go right ahead. If not, I'm just gonna go because I have ideas too. Go ahead, Manu.
I can answer. I've been thinking specifically about imagining in our context what a socialist university would look like in the context of the lockdown and the pandemic. And I'm in Harlem, I'm in New York. So here in New York, university has a lot of housing that could be used for people who need housing. Universities, it was a major disruption to the food chain, the food supply chain in the country, because so much food was being grown and shipped directly to university campuses. And once the campuses locked down, it caused all kinds of breaks. And so, of course, we know that people are standing in line for hours for food. So universities are also places where food is made and distributed, and it could be done on a large scale. And of course, then there's knowledge and skills in universities. There could be testing done in universities for the neighboring community. There could be protocols that are developed. There's all kinds of work and skills and resources on the actual environment, the buildings of the campus, and then in the knowledge that people have. And yeah, it seems, and these are examples from what Karla was talking about. In Kerala, there were students, the university student organizations were going and cleaning up buildings so that they could be used for quarantine, painting, cleaning up buildings so that old buildings so that they could be used for quarantine. There were public action in China, in Vietnam, of people in communities, but also using resources like campuses, university campuses, to address the pandemic. And part of the success of those socialist societies, lies on using those resources in that way. So yeah, that's my piece on that.
Thanks, Manu. Karla, do you have any views on that?
Yeah, that's interesting. I hadn't thought of anything that Manu just said ever, so I really appreciate that. But I was actually going in a different direction with it. Like I was thinking like in an ideal world, what would I want? And like, what does society need? Oh, let's have the resources, let's like problem solve it. And that's probably the examples that Manu's giving concretely, but I guess I just hadn't thought of it in that way. But I'm also thinking about education, right? Like in a structure, right? Like in a building, but then also like education in social movements, like actively, right? And that active like back and forth of doing and trying, and then coming back and evaluating, right? Or like in teacher talk, reflecting, and to go back. So I think that discourse, just making it more accessible to everyone, because we can talk about it here, but unless like we make sure that every single young person is guaranteed this type of education, then like our work isn't done. And so I think just always bringing it back to like the struggle is important.
Thank you, Karla, and Manu. Thank you. I hadn't exactly thought of it like that, Manu, but I appreciate that idea, and I totally agree with it. I want to put in my 2 cents as well in terms of what does a liberated education look like. I really think that schools can be like the heartbeat of a community. I mean, when it comes to children, so many things revolve around our kids, like inevitably. So schools shouldn't be so separate from the home life. You know, it isn't anyways. One of the things that in my group, my core, why I joined was because part of our mission statement was that our children's working living conditions are our working conditions. That you can't separate what's going on at home from what's going on in the school. So if kids are in poverty, that affects how I can teach, right? That affects the child's mind, and that is my workspace. So being able to have a liberal education means that schools are able to provide the resources that every student and their families and the community needs. It should be a place where people can come and go to a clinic. It should be a place where people can come and have food, where parents can also come and learn. It shouldn't just be separate, like we're going to teach your child and you're going to stay over there. There really needs to be more integration so that the knowledge is reinforced throughout the whole community and not just in one, vessel, I guess is how the capitalist system sees it. So I really hope that that something, especially with this whole virtual school and trying to figure out what school looks like now, that we can push towards a vision that actually addresses the real problems of why students may not be able to read, why students have low math scores. It's because they don't have their basic needs met because of the system that we're under. So until we come to that understanding, our kids are going to continue to suffer educationally because they don't have those basic needs met first. So I just wanted to, it's 7:35, so I don't want to not waste time, because this is definitely not a waste of time. But I want to just thank everybody for coming in and listening to us. Thank you, Karla and Manu, so much for your insights. It's really nice to speak to another public educator, well, 2 really public educators and popular educators trying to do that work inside these institutions that, kind of can make it feel like it's impossible, or can make it feel like we're not doing anything, but slowly but surely something's happening. So thank you so much to the People's Forum for hosting us. David, thank you. And everybody, thank you. Have a great night. And I hope that this was helpful for everyone.